All right, so I wanted to talk about the 8 gauge versus 6 gauge versus 2 gauge wires I've got in my battery box. So my go-to, at least for marine wire and aviation wire, is FAA Advisory Circular AC 4313 1B. This is kind of the A&P, which is an aviation mechanic, airframe and power plant specifically, A&P. So kind of like a Bible for the A&Ps. This is more than just an advisory circular. It's actually a pretty substantial document. Your typical advisory circular may only be a page or two, but I mean, this is like a thick book if you buy it in paper. And it's basically, you know, if the aircraft you're working on is not in some sort of maintenance program developed by the manufacturer of the aircraft, this is what you'll use to. These are acceptable practices and techniques for aircraft that aren't in approved maintenance programs. All right, so back in chapter 11, they talk about, you know, ampacity and oh god, what's the equation? I'll sketch out the equation in a second here on a separate piece of paper. All right, so I managed to find a piece of paper where I could write out the equation for the resistance of a wire. So resistance in ohms divided by its length. So this is resistance per unit length. Is that's the Greek letter rho. Looks like a fancy P, but it's rho. That's the resistivity of the wire. This is what the manufacturer should be able to tell you. This is the cross-sectional area of the wire. You can try calculating this yourself, but what a lot of manufacturers do, because this is actually it's a lot easier for solid core wire. For stranded wire, it's not as easy. So what you'll actually, instead of the manufacturers just giving you the resistivity, they'll give you resistivity divided by the cross-sectional area, which is actually the resistance per unit length. This is the number you're going to probably get from the manufacturer for your wire. And they'll say, hey, resistance per unit length for, 8 American gauge wire. They'll give you another resistance per unit length for like 6, and so on and so forth. They're probably not going to give you this number, because this number can sometimes be hard to figure out. So they will do their own testing and give you a resistance per unit length for a specific wire gauge. And that's what they'll typically report. All right, that's enough about that. And then there's some corrections you can do for temperature, and then there's some other corrections you can do for wires in a bundle, and then also wires that are not at sea level. So, you know, as you go higher up in altitude, the air is thinner, so the air has less ability to convect heat away from a wire the higher up you are. Not normally a problem for road vehicles, but certainly a problem for airplanes. All right, let's talk about the battery I'm building. So, yeah, quick refresher. So we're on the 14 volt system. This tells us the wire length we can, well, it's not to exceed this wire length. This is the wire gauge. And these lines are constant current lines. So, I've got about 3 feet round trip from positive and negative. If you want, you can call it 4. I think you'll see it won't matter. And here's the 200 amp line, but remember, I've got 4 wires, cables coming off of the positive, 4 coming off the negative, 2 per cell, and I've got 2 cells in parallel, so that's 2 times 2 is 4. So instead of 200 amps, I'm really on the 50 amp line for evaluating, do I have the right length? So let's follow the 50 amp line down to the 4 foot, and yeah, it's roughly the gauge wire I would need is about 13 gauge, which doesn't exist, so you would use 12. I've got 8. And so 8 at 4 feet. So that's that intersection right there. How much current could I really draw through that? So let's call it 140 amps. So I can draw about 140 amps through each of my 8 gauge wires, battery leads, and I'm only drawing about 50, so I've got a safety factor of 3. Now this is for, where is it? I'm not sure you can read this, but it says conductor chart continuous flow. So in continuous flow, they're assuming at most a half volt voltage drop. So if you go to the next chart, this one's going to be intermittent flow. So this is going to be more of the peaky current, whereas the peaking, it'll like just a temporary spike, and then it comes back down to the average load. The average load is that previous chart. So yeah, 8 gauge. Oh, the wire 4 foot's down at the bottom, so yeah, peak I can do about 240 amps through each of the battery leads. So yeah, I'm pretty good. And oh yeah, so they're allowing for 1 volt on the intermittent and a half a volt on the continuous. So I'm pretty good on the 8 gauge cables. Then if I go back to continuous, and I was figuring on about let's just say 10 or 15 foot loop. Once I get the battery into a trailer or vehicle, yeah, there might be like a 10 or 15, so maybe double it, I don't know, so it's 20 or 30. So here's 20 foot and 30 foot. Let's just call 30. And I want to pull 100 amps max and then drop down. So yeah, so it's in between 1 gauge and 2 gauge. I put 2 gauge wire in, but I'm not really pushing 100 amps around 30 feet of loop. If I'm pushing 100 amps, it's the load straight off of the bus bars that are going to be in the vehicle or the camper. So it's probably more like a 10-foot loop, which is this, let's see, 10 foot with 2 gauge. So here's the 2 gauge. Here's the 10-foot line. And that will push about, yeah, where was it again? 210. So maybe 240 amps, which exceeds what the battery is going to pump out. So, more what's moving around the cabin of the trailer or cab of the vehicle is probably more like 10 to 30 amps. So, and that's on that 30. Yeah, so let's just call it, 30. Yeah, so 6 gauge, which is what I normally use to push current around the cab or cabin of the vehicle or trailer. So I just wanted to show you how all that works. There's some additional charts. So this is the intermittent current again. All right, so wires in a bundle. So if you're running wires in a harness, you need to basically derate the wires, which either means in practice, it means you're going to have to increase the gauge of the increase the size of the wire to reduce the amount of heat being generated. The load's the load, so you're not going to reduce the load, but you might make another harness to, so some of the loads on one harness, some of the loads on the other harness. But in a single bundle, derating means basically making the big wires bigger to avoid the heat problem. Consider wires in a bundle, and then there's an altitude derating. So at 10,000 feet, you want to derate the current by 5%, which isn't a whole lot, where airliners are flying. Man, you can't see the numbers, so let's just tell you. So airliners are flying, 30 to 40,000 feet. Yeah, they're having to derate their cables by 15%. So, all right, that's it for ampacity and derating. That's it. Hope this was useful. To be honest, I use this chart, which is a continuous, and the next chart for intermittent current. For a lot of the wire I use, there isn't a big difference between the kinds of wire types I use. So I'll just go straight to this. This is based on a certain resistivity for milspec wiring. If you don't have milspec wiring, it's not going to be exactly the same, but it's close enough. The temperature is just going to be slightly cooler or slightly higher. It's not going to be like a huge difference. This is going to get you close enough, but if you think it's an issue, go find the resistivity for your wire. You can make your own chart or just put the equation into Excel and do it that way. I just find it easier to have a printout of this laying around rather than go into Excel or a calculator. So, all right, that's it.